What's up, everybody? In this video, we are going to learn how to change content in our messages. At the heart of Node-RED is the ability to examine data and pass it between nodes. As we build more complex flows, being able to track the data is important. Making use of the debug function can help us understand what the data looks like before and after anything we do with the messages. Ensure you have Node-RED running and open it in a browser. You should have our first flow we created open. If you don't, you can load the content from your library, or I've provided a file with the content from my first flow. Double-click the flow name and change it to Changing Message Content. Click Done. On the left-hand column of the Node-RED interface, you will notice a series of nodes. They are labeled under categories relevant to what they do: common, function, network, sequence, parser, and storage. Each node can be used to change how our Node-RED flow works. We'll first look at functions. If you hover your mouse over each node in functions, you will get a pop-up window that explains what they do. Under the functions, select the change node and drag it to your workspace. You will notice that the change function updates to set msg.payload. The payload is the default value that is affected using Node-RED. We want to put the change function in between the inject node and the debug node. Drag the change node over top of the line connecting the inject and debug nodes. You will see the line changes to a dotted line. This indicates that the change node will connect to the other nodes. Doing so will pass data from the output of one node to the input of the next. Let's add a second debug option so we can compare the values before and after it goes through the change function. Drag a debug node to the workspace and connect it to the inject node. Double-click on the change function. You will see that set is the default. Set will replace the entire content of the selected variable and update it with your new content. In this case, it will update the msg.payload. Go ahead and we will update the msg.payload to a new value. Enter goodbye in the input box. Click Done and deploy your flow. Click the inject node and see what happens in the debug window. Cool! We can see the value of the msg.payload before it goes through the change function, where it is hello world, and after the change function, where it becomes goodbye. You will notice that our debug windows are displaying different content. Double-click on the debug2 node and change the output to completemsg.object. Click Done and then click Deploy. Click the inject node, and now you'll see that each debug window is displaying the same data. This will make it easier to see that only the msg.payload is changing between nodes. This is because of the change node we added. All other data stays the same. Let's add some more options to our change function. Before we change our msg.payload from hello world to goodbye, let's make a copy of the data. Double-click the change function. Next, click the Add button. This time we'll use the Move option. The Move option will take a name-value pair and enable us to change the name. In the blank field, you will enter the name you want to use. Since we are creating a new value for the msg.payload, we will use the Move option to create a backup of the original content. So use the name Payload Backup. Click Done and deploy your flow. Click the inject node and see what happens in the debug window. Uh-oh, something's not right here. The msg.payload backup is created, but what happened to the msg.payload? What we are seeing in the debug window should give you some indication. Look at the msg.payload backup and compare it to the msg.payload from the other debug window. Let's update the change function. Double-click on it. Remember that code executes in the order that it is positioned. The same is true for the order of elements in Node-RED. So in our case, we are setting the value of the msg.payload, then moving it to a new name titled Payload Backup. We want to move the content first and then set the value. Click and drag the Move rule over the Set rule. Click Done and deploy your flow. Click the inject node and see what happens in the debug window. Now it is working like we want it to. Let's add another rule. Double-click the change function and click Add. This time, select Change for the rule. This allows us to search for some content and replace it with something else. This time, instead of changing the msg.payload, let's change the msg.topic. In the change rule, update the msg payload to msg.topic. In the search for input, enter first and change it to second. Click Done, then click Deploy and test your flow by clicking the Inject node. We should see that the first debug window shows the data that comes from the Inject node. The second debug window shows us the data that passed through our change function node. Looking at our rules in the change function, we are moving the msg.payload to msg.payloadBackup, setting the msg.payload to goodbye, and changing the msg.topic by searching for the word first and replacing it with second. Let's look at another function, the switch function. Drag a switch node onto the workspace. Put the switch in between the inject node and the change function. Double-click on the switch function. We are going to use the switch function to check the value of the author name. Change the property from msg.payload to msg.author. Click on the down arrow next to the equals equals. What you see should look familiar to you. The switch function enables us to compare values and make decisions based on the results. This is the same as the conditional statements we wrote using Tinkercad. Select the exclamation mark equals, meaning not equal to. In the input, type RBCP. Next, click Add and click the down arrow and select Otherwise. This is the same as an else statement. Click Done. You will see that there are two outputs on the switch function. The top output is for any author value that is not equal to RBCP. The bottom is the else, or any author values that does equal RBCP. Add another debug node to the workspace and change the output to complete MSG object. Drag the bottom output from the switch function to the debug node you just created. Deploy your flow. Click the Inject node and see what happens in the debug window. Since the author's name is RBCP, it does not execute the change function, and the content stays the same in both debug windows. Let's add some more inject nodes to confirm that it works with other author names. Select the inject module on the workspace and copy and paste using Command+C, Command+V on a Mac, or Control+C, Control+V on a PC. Make 2 copies of the inject node. Next, connect the outputs of the new inject modules to the first debug node and the switch function. Double-click on one of the inject modules and change the author to Clark Kent. Click Done and double-click on the second inject module. Change the author to Lois Lane and click Done. Deploy your flow. You can click on any of the inject nodes and see the message content before and after. You could add additional switch or change functions within your flow depending on your project. Let's recap what we've done using Node-RED. We have 3 inject nodes. When we click on any of them, they will send the data we have populated them with to a debug node and a switch node. The switch node will check the msg.author property and send the data to a change node if the author's name does not match a certain criteria. If the data goes through the change node, we change the name of the msg.payload to msg.payloadBackup, set the msg payload to goodbye, and change the msg.topic content by searching for first and changing it to second. We also use debug nodes to track the data as it goes between nodes. At the end of this video, you should understand how to use a switch and change function to modify content from an inject node using Node-RED.